Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Thomas Heinis, who joins us from computing. I think our earliest, our first PI from computing in the LCN officially. So this is great. So thanks very much. We're very happy to have you as part of the LCN. So Thomas is currently a senior inverted comma for some reason lecturer in computing. He has previously studied at ETH Zurich and holds a PhD and MSc from there in Switzerland. Then he was a postdoctoral fellow in the DIAS lab at EPFL, and DIAS is Data Intensive Application and Systems Laboratory. And after that, he went to Purdue University for a Fulbright fellowship, and then I guess after that you joined Imperial, where you're now leading the Scale lab, and amongst other things, and working on DNA origami, and we've been discussing about AFM and various experimental areas. But it would be great to hear about your research on DNA nanostructures as a data storage medium. So thank you very much for giving this seminar today, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Please put questions in the chat or raise your hand afterwards. There'll be a discussion as well. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It all has a new meaning now, doesn't it? Kind of the floor is yours, but it's all virtual these days. Anyway, yeah, so the talk today is probably going to be a little bit different from what you hear normally here. And like Sandrine just said, I'm the first member of LCN from computing, and I do things on data. So what's the connection, you might ask? And I'm going to explain today, right? So, but it's going to be a little bit different, probably. But I'll keep it high level. I don't expect you to know too much about computing or data storage, which is ultimately what this is about, right? So good. So what I want to talk about is really using DNA nanostructure as a storage medium for arbitrary information. And you may have heard of DNA storage, and I want to talk a little bit about what this is about, what DNA storage is, why this is a good idea. And then also I want to lead on, of course, to the work that we're doing in that space, which is to try to store information in DNA nanostructures. And when I say DNA nanostructure, I usually kind of mean DNA origamis, but I do find origami a little bit a term that is not scientific enough. That's why I call it nanostructures, but it's the same thing, really. All right, so good. So why is this even a thing? Why do we need to think about storing data in DNA? The reason being that we produce a lot of data. With everything we do these days, everywhere we click, we produce data, structured, unstructured, but it's growing rapidly. And the slide here says that, for example, that we're having 175 zettabytes of data produced in everything together. I couldn't tell you how many zeros a zettabyte has, but it's a lot of data, and we're running out of storage medium to store all this data. And one other thing is that a lot of this data is what we consider cold data, basically saying that it's data that we need to keep around, probably for regulatory purposes or because we're interested in it, right? But we're highly likely never to touch it again. The chances really are we'll never touch it again. But we need to keep it around. Regulatory purposes sometimes say we have to keep it around for 80 years, 100 years. And if you think about your family photos, you probably want to keep them around for at least a couple of generations, right? So again, a couple of 100 years, probably, or 100 plus years, right? And that's also what we're seeing really is that a lot of data needs to be kept around for a long time. Now, traditionally, what we do in computer sciences, right? And this is what I teach in the first year, for example, we have this kind of storage hierarchy, SSD being at the top, for data that we access frequently and where we want to have very, very fast access, right? And at the bottom, we have HDD, the hard disk drive, barely used anymore on the desktop these days, but still used in data centers. And then also tape. And it's particularly these two storage media that we use for to store data in the long term, right? Because they are cheap, they are slow, But because this is data that we infrequently access, if we access it ever again or at all, that's okay. It's an interesting trade-off, right? Data that we don't want to access, we're not going to access frequently, we put it on cheap storage medium that are potentially slow, but we're okay with that because, oh, hello, this isn't showing. Oh, so here we go, so it's back. Sorry, so we basically store archival data, and a lot of the data we produce today, we store on tape and disk. But if we are to store this for hundreds of years, or just even 80 years or 60 years, then we probably need to migrate this, right? If you look at how long we keep data around, a lot of it now, and this is just has been done a couple of years ago. This pie chart, right? A lot of the data we're storing now is, even you can look at the pie chart says it, right? 27.8% of the data we're storing today, we plan to keep around for hundreds of years, right? Or more than 100 years. That's a long time. And if we want to store this on tape or disk, the problem we run into is that tape or disk have a lifetime of 10, 20 years max. That's optimistic. And so if we want to really keep it around, we need to migrate it between these types of storage media. So from a new tape, from an old tape to a new tape, every round about 15 years or something similar. And it's a costly process, costs money, it produces energy, and the old tapes, and typically also the old tape drives or the old disks, because we can't use them anymore, that basically leads to electronic waste. So it's a wasteful process, it's an expensive and wasteful process. And that's exactly where DNA comes in. Right? DNA is one of the most important properties of it is it's very durable, right? We can read it back using sequencing. We can still read DNA with reasonable accuracy from a couple of hundred years ago, right? So it's very durable. The other aspect that I want to mention, and I don't have it explicitly on the slides, one interesting aspect of DNA is that we have an eternally relevant read head. What I mean by that is that even if, say, we want to read this in a couple of hundred years, right? In a couple of hundred years, we'll probably still be able to sequence DNA, because we're going to need it for life science applications, for precision medicine, and so on. So we, as a society, or whatever we'll call it, we will most likely be able to read that or sequence DNA in a couple of hundred years, right? And the same can't be said for disk or tape, right? Because they change, the technology changes quite quickly there, introducing all kinds of issues. Yes, so the durability and the long-term option of being able to read that data is important. You even have today, you have small companies that guarantee you to store your data for hundreds of years, right? And you know, whether that technology they're using still exists in hundreds of years is questionable, but what's even more questionable is if this company will still be around in the hundreds of years. So if we're thinking about long-term data archival, long-term data storage, we really need a mechanism to be able to read that data back. All right. I think I covered durability. That's really the key property, in my opinion anyway, why we want to store data in DNA. Then it's also very dense. And that has many implications, one being that we require less space, and on a practical level, this also means we can design much smaller data centers, and when we have much smaller data centers, we also need much less energy to run them. Good. Then another aspect is that we're running out of silicon, whereas for DNA, we have all the building blocks abundantly available. And then finally, one reason for using DNA is a little bit outside what I want to talk about in this presentation, but it also has the potential for computation. We can use molecular processes to kind of mimic computations on top of data that is stored in DNA. And the interesting aspect really is that it's massively parallel. in the sense that you know, it's not fast, but we can all run operations on all DNA strands in parallel. Good. So the way DNA storage works, the classical approach, I'm going to say, is that basically we, this is just a background slide about DNA, which I'm sure all of you are well aware of how DNA looks and the basics of it, right? The way we then store information in DNA is really quite simple. We take a arbitrary data, take the binary representation, which is shown there at the top of that, basically encode it into a sequence of nucleotides, and then synthesize this into DNA molecules. And you know, this one molecule typically these days, or one DNA molecule is about 200 to 300 nucleotides long. That's what can we get, what we can get from commercial companies these days quite easily. So if you want to store any meaningful amount of data, you're going to have thousands, if not millions, of these DNA molecules or oligos, right? And then to read back, again, this is this kind of read head that I talked about before. We use sequencing. And sequencing changes, you know, we went from sequencing by synthesis to now nanopore sequencing. But like I said, the argument I made, quite important for this presentation, really, we want to have some technology that we can piggyback on, in a sense, that allows us to read this data in 10, 20, 40, 50, 100 years and so on. Anyway, so we sequence that, we get it back, and then we decode it, applying error correction codes to essentially get with high fidelity the data that we encoded back, right? And because the DNA channel has, if you understand the DNA molecule as a channel, it has all kinds of issues in synthesis, or errors in synthesis, in storage potentially, and also in sequencing. But we can compensate that with adequate error correction codes that we can bake into the data we store in the sequence. Good. And so mapping this is fairly simple, right? We have there's a bit of a lag between my clicking and what shows.
Yeah, you're still on the storing information in DNA molecules.
Yeah, I know, but on the iPad, I'm well ahead. Oh, shoot. Okay, here we are. Good. So, so translating this then is quite simple, right? We basically want to map between a binary string to a molecule or a sequence that we then turn into a molecule through synthesis. And we want to have this as compact as possible. We don't want to waste any space. So a mapping could be as simple as what I'm showing here. We map 2 bits to a nucleotide and then basically translate that. The reality is a little bit more complicated in that we have biological constraints that don't allow us to use any arbitrary sequence of nucleotides. We also, like I mentioned, we have errors that can occur at any stage in the process, and writing, storing, or reading. And so we need to also bake in error correction codes. And so what we typically see today is that we can't store, as is kind of this slide suggests 2 bits per nucleotide, which is typically going to be around 1.5. And there are theoretical limits that we can't push there, right? Now, why is it that we are so big on kind of having this kind of compact code, as I call it, to stuff as much information into as few nucleotides as possible? The reason being that DNA synthesis today is simply very expensive, very expensive. It's orders of magnitude of compared to writing to tape or disk, right? That's also what brings me to the next slide, which is essentially this kind of the status of this classical approach, as I call it. This is what the research community by and large does, is try to store data in sequences, right, in DNA sequences. And, you know, the status really is that reading is pretty much getting where it's supposed to be. The demand in the life science market for sequencing drives the price down where it roughly needs to be. But for synthesis, we're way too far off. Really, orders of magnitude. Writing 1 bit now in a DNA sequence roughly costs about 12 cents. It's probably cheaper by now, a little bit, but 12 cents for a bit of information is just way off, right? It's going to be a fraction of a cent for writing a bit on tape or disk. So we're not there. And that's also the biggest, in my opinion, the major roadblock in getting DNA storage as a practical application into the data centers, the cost of writing. If it was the opposite way around, if the reading was too expensive, that's something we could probably deal with, because like I said initially, we want to write all the data, but we're probably not going to read all of it ever again, but we need to have it around for regulatory purposes, as I mentioned, right? So we could probably deal with that, but writing being too expensive is a big issue for this technology. And it will get cheaper. Question is, will it get cheap enough for our purposes, right? So this is also why a lot of research efforts focus on making writing or DNA synthesis cheaper. And there are a couple of approaches to that. You know, we can, for example, for biological purposes, we need to have 100% accuracy when synthesizing. For DNA's data storage, we don't, because we can incorporate error correction codes that then allow us to read back. Right? There are other ideas like an expanded alphabet, synthetic molecules altogether, motif-based synthesis, where you don't synthesize every bit, but you have building blocks that you then staple or ligate together into longer representations, so that you basically can kind of break this dependence on synthesis. And then finally, and this is the reason why I'm here and I'm talking to you, is the final approach is to use DNA nanostructures to store information. And that's what I briefly want to talk about now, kind of giving you an overview about what we work on, what we're trying to do, and kind of what our research agenda is. Good. So what are DNA nanostructures? I can't judge the audience here very well. Most of you probably know what it is. I'll just give a very brief overview, which is essentially 2D or 3D nanoscale structures built out of DNA, where you take a scaffold, which is circular DNA, and you add staples to it, which through annealing basically force the scaffold in a specific structure. The way this works is as follows, right? You have the scaffold, you have a ton of short staples, you put that together under the right conditions, the staples force the scaffold in a specific 2D or 3D structure, depending on how we look at it, right? And I have a fancy video for that as well, which shows you that there's the big scaffold coming in with all the staples, and that forces it into a specific structure. Now, our idea is basically to store data or information no longer in the sequence, but in the shape of the structure. That's what we want to do. More precisely, what we want to do is kind of have what we call a breadboard structure, a generic structure, a nanostructure that we build out of scaffold and staples. And then we have defined positions at which we can attach bigger atoms or proteins. Streptavidin is what we're using at the moment. If we set a bit to 1 and we don't attach the streptavidin if we set it to 0. Simple as that, right? And what we then want to do is read that out via microscopy. That's shown at the bottom of the slide, right? We have input data. We write this on this breadboard structure, and again, right, like with the oligos or with the DNA sequences, we're going to need thousands of them to store any kind of meaningful amount of data. But we store that, and then we use microscopy to read it back, and a bit of machine learning and computer vision to decode the content of what was stored on the nanostructures to get the output data. Again, here, right, we have this microscopy. We use microscopy to read it back. Again, this is a read head, which is probably going to be around in 100 years again. If anything will happen, the resolution will, and I'm being entirely naive here. I don't know what the roadmap is for AFM, but fundamentally the resolution is not going to get worse, is what I'm trying to say, right? If anything, it's going to get better, helping us in that process. Good. So that's pretty much what we're trying to do. We also have the approach is we work on an approach where you can also write and delete. So we have on the breadboard structure on the Origami. We have specific structure addresses where we can attach these streptominions or whatever we use, and we can add writing complexes to it, right, to write in specific bit positions to reflecting the data that we will store. And we can also delete from it, or we will be able to delete from it if we manage to do so, by basically adding a deleting complex, which will push whatever was stored away and lead to waste there, right? We are very much at the beginning of this. We have, I'm going to show a little bit of the data we have so far. But what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to store Imperial College. Apologies to anyone who is not working at Imperial, but we're trying to store something like that on a couple of these nanostructures and read it back fundamentally before it's shown that it works with simple experiments. I can maybe show this right here. This is our proof of concept data here, where we stored around about 170, or we can store about 170 bits per one layer structure that we use per one breadboard, right? And like I said, we need multiple of those to make this, to be able to store any meaningful amount of data. And also, I mentioned before, right, we want to then basically feed that into machine learning pipeline. We've put this up already, and then we can decode this automatically. We essentially throw the images coming from AFM to the machine learning pipeline and decode automatically there. Right? There's a lot of, we are at the moment, probably unsurprisingly, mostly because I said we focus, the most important problem to solve is the right side. That's why we also focus on the right side at the moment on in working on this. We also need, eventually, we'll need to look at the read side. But we'll get there, of course. Good. So just to maybe give an overview of what we are, where we are, right? I mentioned we have shown that it works, that it can work. We are now trying to improve. We want to increase the size of structures, either using longer scaffold, which is a little bit tricky because the ones that are commercially available are the ones that we're using, and they are already the biggest, but bigger ones can potentially be made. We also want to combine multiple of the structures or multiple of the origamis into one, just by annealing or stitching them together into bigger structures, which makes our life easier. It gives us more capacity to store information because we need less of the capacity spent on indexing. And yes, it's kind of stitching together as such, right? And then we need to optimize pretty much everything. We want to optimize protocols. We want to use microfluidics to do so, which is tricky. Apparently, we want to optimize the read side. We need to optimize a lot. You'll see optimize a lot, right? We need to also incorporate error correction codes. That we can only do, right, for this. To do this, we need to understand what the errors are, really. And we can probably guess what some of the errors are, like streptomini not attaching and other types of errors, but we need to characterize these errors, how frequent they are, when they happen, etc., to really do a good job there with the error correction codes. The more optimization of optimizing the storage. We by and large assume, and preliminary data shows that as well, that that DNA nanostructure origamis have a similar durability than DNA itself, right? Which is important. This is really what we're banking on here. And then overall, we need to optimize the pipeline. Good. So that's kind of all I wanted to say on a high level. Just to summarize, so the key property of DNA that we're interested in is really the durability. And there are others, I said it, right? Density, availability, etc. But it's one of the central part really is durability, which makes it interesting for long-term archival storage. There are people thinking about bringing it onto the desktop. That might eventually happen, but it's really it's too soon for that, really. And also, once you bring on desktop competing with SSD or anything similar, it's just not a good. you know, what is the key property of DNA that makes it competitive with SSD? None, right? So that's a little bit. So I'm a little bit skeptical there, but time will tell, of course. The only problem, and I highlighted this talking about the state of the art with sequence-based DNA storage, is really the cost of synthesis. And so many ways, people are working ways around that. Our approach is really to use these kind of nanostructures and to store information not in the sequence, in the order of the sequence, but in the structure of the origami, really. And we believe at the moment that the cost is to write, that we are seeing to write on DNA nanostructures or origamis is indeed in the order of tape, writing to tape, which means it's very, very, very cheap, and it's quite promising on that front. Reading is a bit more expensive at the moment, but we will be working on that. Good, so that's all I wanted to say for the time being. The last slide is going to be just to say, it's not updated, but that's all right. We are basically looking for collaborators. If you know anyone who might be interested, please do let me know. Just pop a message if you can. And we're looking in the EU for EU calls that are available for DNA storage at the moment, right? So we're looking for particularly for microscopy, automation, microfluidics, and also DNA origamis in general. And we're also looking for collaborators in the UK, and they're specifically interested in medical applications for DNA origamis. Good. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much for this fascinating talk. Very unique perspectives here on computing, and so yeah, great to hear from you, and thanks for sharing your ideas and your plans. Are there any questions from the audience here? Yeah. So we'll start with Irina. Do you want to unmute?
Yes. Hi, Thomas. Thank you so much. It was great presentation, and it's really interesting. I was just wondering, how would you force this nanostructure into particular shapes or positions?
So it's basically through. Let me go see if I can go back. I'm not sure if that was very helpful in it, but basically by adding these staples that then anneal in specific positions of the scaffold, right? We design them such that they kind of attach, one half of it attaches in a specific location, and the other half kind of attaches in another position, right? Which is exactly complementary to the scaffold, and then kind of forces it into a shape. And then if you do this with a lot of staples, then you really get the kind of the shape that you need. There are limitations, of course.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And one more, how would you is there any specific requirements for storing it for, let's say, longer term?
So that is something, there's one paper available, which we're going to use the same protocols. We don't know yet how, if there's anything specific to origamis that we need to do, or if there's anything different, fundamental difference from sequence-based DNA storage. But for sequences or for DNA molecules, it's basically remove all energy from the system, no light, no, as cold as possible, and these type of things.
Okay.
So I expect the same to be true for origamis, but it's something we need to test. It's a big hypothesis we have at the core of our work. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is William Morton. Are you able to?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. I have a optimistic and a pessimistic question for you. The optimistic one being, you mentioned that sequencing gets about 1.5 bits per pair. I was wondering, how much does the breadboard that you were talking about here increase that by?
Sorry, I'm not sure what it's to do with metrics about reading, but I'm not sure if I understood.
You said that in like regular encoding, if you say that a T is 0, 1, you got about 1.5 bits per pair. In the breadboard technique, being that the creating this length of pairs is the difficult part, writing is the difficult part, how much does this breadboard technique increase that by, the number of bits per pair?
That is, you got me there. We're not improving it at all.
Okay.
If anything, it's getting worse. But I mean, we just, also I made a big fuss, not a big fuss, but I mentioned initially quite prominently the density aspect of DNA being a benefit of it, right? We lose density. We're not as dense as is the DNA oligos-based DNA storage, right? Because we, if you take the numbers, so if we store for one breadboard structure, we need a scaffold of 8,000 nucleotides, then a bunch of staples. I have to ask the PhDs in how many, but you can already tell if we store it 170 bits, then we're already losing compared to sequence-based DNA storage.
So then the benefit is that it's rewritable.
It's rewritable, but also, the staples, we're always going to use the same staples.
Right.
So we can mass produce them quite cheaply.
Okay.
This is a good point. I'm glad you asked this question because it seems to be a point I didn't make clearly. It's really we break the dependence. So when we need to write the bits, we don't need to synthesize anything. We just take our staples, our scaffolds, and then just put it together in the way we need, right? So we really move away from having to synthesize everything and break this dependence on it, really.
Okay.
Sorry,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that must have been lost. Yeah, sorry.
And then my second question was,
that's the one, right?
So you mentioned, that basically one of the problems with companies storing data is the longevity of that. What happens if the company goes under, stops storing the data, etc.? Doesn't the breadboard also run into that same problem? Whereas if a different sequencing or encoding mechanism is preferred, then anything on the breadboards will then go by the wayside.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. However, what we strive to do is really also, by the way, to be absolutely honest, we also work on sequence-based DNA storage. It's just, I can't focus. That's why I try everything at the same time. But it's like, you're absolutely right. But also for sequence-based, right? There's nothing. There have been people who worked on this what they call artificiality, so that you can tell that a DNA sequence isn't natural but might store data. I don't quite believe in that. But what we need for every of these long-term storage mediums, we need instructions store them in some way, right? I know people who work, for example, for sequence-based stuff. They work on packaging everything, but it's not clever. They take a nanopore, a minion from MinION from Oxford Nanopore, and package it up and put the software. But none of this will work in 100 years, right? you need the flow cell as well. Yeah. So really, what we need is to be able to give to make simple instructions on how to read the data. And for us, this would probably be for the nanostructure approach, for the Origami approach, would basically look at it on the AFM with this and that resolution, and then this is the mapping we used, and that's all we can really do realistically, right?
Well, so yeah, if you were to sequence access, so say you were to use this information incorrectly, if you were to sequence the entire breadboard and the pieces, the staples that you've attached to it, there would be no way then to essentially backtrace saying we know that this structure is the breadboard, these pairs are the breadboard.
So if you were to sequence the breadboard structure, you could actually, if you take each of these structures individually, you could disassemble and then sequence them, and then you know what was stored on it.
Okay.
But our preferred way is simply because then you have a limited throughput, right? And you can be structure by structure, and if you go through microscopy, you can just do it much faster.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
But just a bit. I hope I answered the question. But just to add on that, it's really you have a very valid point. Right? I feel like if we want to say that, or we want to make sure that we can read a piece of data in 100 years, we just need to make as few assumptions about available technology as possible, or as realistic assumptions. I think that's the only thing we can do realistically.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully the technology will still be accessible, or even better. Okay, we've still got a question from Tony. Would you like to?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Thomas. That was a really enjoyable talk. When you talk about the cost of DNA synthesis, you're talking about, if you like, the chemical approach. But I think people have used DNA polymerase to synthesize single-stranded DNA, so not PCR, but simply sequential addition of dNTPs in whatever order you wanted to create any arbitrary sequence. And I just wondered, whether that would, to some extent, remove the objection about the cost of DNA synthesis. I'm
not quite sure in terms of language. Are you referring to enzymatic synthesis?
Yeah, so using DNA polymerase, sorry.
Yeah. No, sorry.
Not PCR.
This is to do with my background, so that's why I need to map it to what I know. So enzymatic, yes, everybody says it's the future. At the moment, we also have at Imperial, we have a printer from syntax printer from DNA Script, right, which is enzymatic. At the moment, the prices seem to be a little bit higher, but what is interesting about it is it's supposed to also deliver longer sequences, which actually also makes the price drop because we need, we per sequence or per oligo, we need to store the index information, which takes away capacity, and the longer we can go, the longer sequence is, the shorter this portion relatively short it becomes. So yeah, that's what enzymatic synthesis promises. At the moment, we don't see it yet. And my main worry is in general about sequence-based DNA storage is that there just isn't enough demand in the life science market, driven by life science applications, to drive the price down low enough. That might be the problem here.
Yeah, I mean, it also has the advantage of being much more environmentally benign than the chemical synthesis.
Absolutely. I was told you can drink it at the end, but I'm not sure I want to.
I'm sure you can.
Well, yeah, everything can be, you can drink anything. But anyway.
Thank you. Lots of discussion. So Hamish, you had your hand up?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for your talk. It's really interesting. Just picking up more on what Tony was saying about decreasing costs in synthesis. More just a comment than anything about, I think it's a paper by, is it Yazdi, about use of degenerate bases for essentially decreasing the cost of synthesis. I don't know whether you've seen the paper or not, but I think it's an interesting.
Is it the one from the other day? Just not too long ago is what I want to say.
No, it was when I wrote my master's thesis.
Okay, that was a while ago, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but essentially what they do is at an individual position, they have kind of like a proportion of, say, A and a proportion of C. And using that, they can essentially get around this problem of, they can kind of trade off between synthesis and sequencing costs. Just a kind of comment on that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. I mean, there are a couple of things that people try, right? That I also mentioned. I didn't talk about it much, but also kind of using XNA, which we're also trying to do. But you basically add the number of the alphabet, but the density doesn't really. You're basically shaving kind of single digits in percent off the cost, or maybe we need orders of magnitude, and so maybe everything taken together will deliver, but it's going to be a long way, I think, for sequence-based DNA storage. Also, an interesting point you made is really about the motif-based approach, for example, really works by taking pre-produced, cheaply mass-produced kind of fragments that are then stitched together. The way it's done, unfortunately, it makes synthesis cheaper, or the right process cheaper, but it actually pushes cost to the read side, right? Like you just said. So there's also this trade-off, which actually at the moment it would be interesting to do because really read is cheap enough and write is just far too expensive. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. I had just a question on the staples. So how selective is it? Because you're doing you're reacting between base pairs of the main DNA strand. Is that right?
Sorry, didn't understand.
The state. I'm just trying to picture the concept of this staple. It seemed that it was linking some nucleotides from neighboring chains or from different parts of a main pair, and how selective is this going to be, or are you going to have different possibilities of stapling different parts of your DNA?
So we basically use, I couldn't tell you where the scaffold is from. It's from some bacteria, and then I think it's pretty much chosen because it's A, circular, and B, it's because it's had a kind of high variability of the nucleotides and patterns in a sense, and that gives us multiple options to force it into a shape, depending on the staples we choose.
But will you always get the same shape?
Yes.
Okay.
If you have the same shape,
it's deterministic. It's not
some
kind of neuromorphic process or something like that you could use.
Well, you say deterministic, right? I'm a computer scientist. Things to me are zeros and ones, and in biology it's a mess. So, but yeah, it's by and large deterministic. Yeah.
Okay. So right, that sounds good. Okay. Yeah, really fascinating. And on the AFM, I mean, hopefully there is some ways that we can work on the reading there. But if there are no more questions, I think we surveyed the chemistry, the biology, and the computing aspect. So and of course all bound by nano. So that's great. So thanks very much, and thanks for also giving all your details there. So if there are any discussions that need to follow up, then we can get in touch with you. All right. Yep. There it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.